Thank you for joining us today on this webinar covering routes in Dynamics 365 for accurate costing. We are going to be covering a few topics around routes, costing sheets, cost categories, and then tying it all together at the end to kind of give you an idea of how these all play together in forming accurate costing for products that go through production processes. So our agenda today, we're going to be talking about routes and route versions. We're going to be showing how those operations work into routes and the operational relations, how cost categories fit into route operations, how the costing sheet ties into cost categories and the overall structure, and then at the end, calculating machine and labor costs for released products. So let's jump right in. Let's jump in first with understanding routes and route versions, right? So what does a route represent in Dynamics? From a high level, a route is the step-by-step production process required to make a product. Now, obviously, this process is highly variable and depends on the manufacturing environment in which you're operating in. But as like a very general high-level best practice thought, a route is simply saying what steps and what machines and what workers or employees are involved with the production of a finished good. And each one of those steps are going to be defined with what we call route components. And the three main route components that we have are operations, resources, and route groups. And those routes help define production flow in the sense that they are nominally represented on each step throughout the route and can be defined with specific workers, machines, tools, work centers, and integrated into kind of how much time does it take to set up before these routes, how much processing time occurs on each one of these operations, and then how much put away time occurs on each one of these operations. Now, you can have more than one route, obviously, per production environment, and you can assign more than one route to a release product. But for one production order, only one route can exist on that production order. So best practices for routes would be to start simple, right? So if you are just getting into setting up routes and route components and route operations in your Dynamics 365 workspace, starting simple is obviously the best way to go. And then as you iterate through and start to get more knowledge from your actual production operation into the ERP system, tailoring the routes and making them more specific to the actual real life scenarios that these manufactured items are going through. So here are a couple of different types of routes that can exist in the system. The most simple route would be going in just a linear fashion. So step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, on and on and on and on. That's represented here by that simple route diagram, right? That you start at the beginning on step 10, and the manufactured item follows a process from 1, 2, 3, 4, and then finished. You can also do something called a complex route, and that would be where the production, the release product that's being produced has a non-linear path, right? You might start in one work cell or one machine in one part of a production area and have another piece start in another space in a production area, and then they meet up as you move on through the production process. And that's represented here in this complex route diagram, where we have operations 10 and 15 meeting up with operations 10 and 25, or 20 and 25, sorry, and when they get to step 30, and then maybe having step 40 as kind of a offshoot. Think of maybe like a quality management or something, where you're going through and doing some kind of quality control work before it reaches the end. They're represented by step 50. The other type of route that you can have is something called a parallel route, where you have a couple of single operations, and then one single operation can feed into multiple different operations at the same time. And you can decide on your route whether or not you want to make each one of these required, or if you want to make some of them optional to be completed in order to get to step 40, which would represent kind of our finishing step in this route. So let's understand route operations and operational relations, right? An operation is a step on the route, or sorry, it's a step on the production process, right? And what happens on this step would be a worker or a machine or some kind of thing that happens that you want to define and you want to make specific costing notes for. So as we go through the production process, each one of these operational nodes, as we like to think of them, become important and are useful when you're trying to define different things on the route. And some of those would be what's listed here on my screen, right? So you can define cost categories, you can define consumption parameters, so defining how the system treats the consumption of raw materials on the BOM, what processing times are involved with the setup and the quality checks and the consumption of raw materials, any resource requirements that take place on these route steps. So that would be, are we required to have certain workers involved, certain machines involved, and then any kind of notes or instructions to the worker that is working on that step can also be defined on the route operation. So let's just talk about what resources are required for each route operation. To make a very simple route, there are no resource requirements that are required. You can simply say, I want to build something, but I'm not sure what I'm required to do on my operational route steps. Therefore, I just want to give 100% capacity to my route step and have whatever I'm building flow through with no issue. We talked about best practices a little bit earlier. This is a great way to start if you're not entirely sure how you want to configure your route to build your finished good, and you just want to get something that works. So you would define a operational route capacity with 100%, and that route capacity could be your worker has no capacity, or your machine has no capacity, your tooling has no capacity, or your work center has no capacity. That plays really well with when we talk about master resource planning, where you're trying to plan operations in the production space to kind of see how much you can build in a given period of time. If you're not ready to get that complex with your route operations, you can give it 100% capacity, and therefore there's no restrictions when you're planning or trying to forecast how much you can set up and trying to firm planned production orders. Obviously, there's a downside to that, right? Because now you wouldn't have an accurate representation of what you can actually build in a real-life production environment. So when we get into kind of defining those specific things on a route, let's jump into our dynamics environment and take a look at what a route looks like and where we can set these capacity restrictions. So if I come into dynamics, and we're going to come into the routes, which can be found under modules, it can be found under production control, under operations, and under all routes here. That will bring us to this screen where all the routes that you've created in your system exist. In here, you can create routes, which obviously just have a route number and a standard name. You can also assign specific routes to item groups. And this allows you to natively link those two without defining specific release product relations between a route. Obviously, just like bills of material, these routes need to be approved before they can be worked on. And that approval can be done by anyone with the proper security clearance. And they can be unapproved if they phase out and are no longer needed by the manufacturing environment. Down here in our versions, this is where we define where the released products are linked to the routes. So if we have a release product down here that's linked to this route, when you go to set up a production order, it's natively going to try to pick the active route version to use for that production order. And you can see here, we have an active route right here. So inside of each route, like we talked about before, there are operations. And those can be seen by going here to this route details button. And inside here, we have a bunch of operation numbers. We have a priority associated with each one of those. And we have the name of the operation, and then the next operation in the step. And you'll notice at the very end, the very last operation is always signified with a 0, indicating that that's the last operation. And once that operation step is completed, then the production order could be reported as finished. So a few things to note that we've mentioned already. Down here in the lower part of this, where we can define different characteristics related to each one of these operation steps. Now, the important ones to take note of, specifically around the generating accurate costing using routes, would be under the setup tag. We have the costing resource that we can define, and then we also have 3 different cost categories that we can define. And we're going to dive into cost categories in just a second. But as far as defining them on each operation step, you can have a different cost category for any kind of setup time that's consumed, any kind of run time for the operation that's consumed, any kind of quality checks that are done on whatever is generated on that route operation step. Now, I keep saying like specifying how long it takes to process something in a route. If you are looking to simply kind of estimate how much it's going to cost to produce 1 unit of a produced good, you can come into here in this times tab and again, this is per route operation, and define how much setup time something takes, how much run time something takes, how much transit time something takes. Transit time meaning how long does it take for a operator on this route step to go and procure some material before they are ready to begin processing whatever they need to process on this route operation step. So in this example here, right, our first operation is speaker assembly. So you can imagine in a manufacturing environment, the transit time would represent how long it takes the worker to go and grab speaker assembly parts off the shelf and bring it back in order to begin the work order. So you can define all of that on a basis for this route, and then define the quantity of product that you are producing in this amount of time. Okay. And for each one of these operation steps, different cost categories, costing resources, and times exist. And so I said earlier about starting simple with routes. It's important to remember you might not know all of this information kind of while you're building these routes initially, which is why it's important to just keep things simple. And then as you build the route, as you develop the knowledge a little bit more, you can get more specific with the queue times, with the setup times, with all of these times that flow into this. One more important thing to define on the route per route operation would be these resource requirements. And you can define requirement types in multiple different ways, right? You can define a resource as a requirement type. And again, a resource would be a worker, a machine, a tool, or a work center. You can define resource groups. So that would be like if you have a bunch of machines represented as resources that fall under the same umbrella, you can put them all into a resource group and assign that resource group to the operation step. So maybe if you don't really care which machine is used in a production sense, you can simply just assign it to all the machines in that resource group, and each one of those machines would have a defined capacity, and that capacity would help you with master resource scheduling and planned production orders, kind of workload balancing and that kind of thing. Okay, so now that we have just kind of an idea of what the route looks like, let's dive into a little bit more cost-specific things, specifically into these cost categories. So setting up cost categories. So if you want to set up cost categories, and we're going to dive right back into dynamics in just a second here, we're going to go into this menu tree, production control, setup routes, cost categories. And before we get in there, let's just define what is a cost category. So simply put, a cost category drives accumulation for labor and machine time, and it defines categories for labor, machine setup, and overhead. So that allows you to put in predetermined values for labors, machines, setup, overhead, and have those values work in direct line with the amount of time that it's going to take to process one step in that route operation and give you an accurate cost for the overhead, for the machines that are worked, and all of the materials that are consumed on that step. So let's jump right back into dynamics and take a look at what cost categories look like. So again, you follow that same tree to get here that I just mentioned before, which is in production control. We're going to go to the routes over here and cost categories. Okay. And inside of cost categories here, we have a few that have been set up in this environment already. And we can see that under this assembly cost category, which again, if I go back to that route I was working on, remember that was my operation assembly that I was working on. So if I come back in here to the assembly, you can see it's been assigned a category of assembly, and we've given it a price right here. And you can also define a worker and a cost group if you need to. So obviously, because there's no specific worker assigned with assembly, we've left this field blank, right? Because theoretically, a large group of workers could be involved in the assembly of this product. And this cost group here is specifically related to the cost structure of assembly. And that'll become a little bit more clear when we dive into the costing sheet in just a second. And then we can also define any ledger postings here for each one of these cost categories, obviously. So you can see both physical and financial transactions can be defined on the GL here. So that means that any kind of WIP that's going through this route operation step when a production order is being worked on is going to be stored in these ledgers in the GL. Okay, so each cost category is assigned to the cost group, and that helps segment labor cost contributions, it helps segment machine cost contributions, and it helps give you an overhead basis for formulas if you're using that in your production environment, right? And then this segmentation using cost groups helps support an accurate roll-up of the cost when you go into the release product and you go to estimate the item price. It also provides accurate analysis and accurate reporting if you're going and looking at, like we mentioned, trying to report on what costs are being associated with different groups throughout the production process. Okay, so we've looked at that, set up some cost categories. A good tip that I've discovered, kind of throughout my career working in dynamics, is that it's important to use consistent naming conventions for clarity when working with cost groups. This helps just normal people that are looking at these cost categories to understand exactly what they mean, right? There are some instances, like, for example, when you're naming a route, that you would have like a generic number for a route because you can have multiple routes and they can be very broad or very specific depending on what exactly is being produced in that production environment. And they don't really relate to exactly what's taking place, since they could be such a broad thing being built. Like if you think about speaker assembly, you could call a route speaker assembly, but as we saw in the route operations, there's many different operations that are occurring in that production route. So it might seem a little bit kind of pointless to name it simply just speaker assembly. But if you are working with cost categories, because you can get so specific with cost categories since they're assigned to each operation on the route, use really consistent naming conventions that refer exactly to what's being costed in that route operation step, so that when you're looking at WIP reports and you're trying to figure out, okay, what exactly is being posted to these ledgers for production, you see exactly what they're named, giving you a clear idea of what's actually being built and worked on in that route operation step. Okay, so like I just talked about, quick summary of cost categories here, right? Cost categories help classify production activities. They help define cost rates for each activity. They segment costs for analysis. They drive accurate labor and machine costing in routes. They provide the basis for overhead formulas, and they ensure correct cost roll-ups in BOMs and production orders. good, easy to remember summary for what cost categories do in routes. Now, let's move on to talking about the costing sheet, which is the other hand of the route operation and getting accurate costing. Okay, so what is the purpose of the costing sheet in Dynamics? Simply put, the costing sheet provides a formatted display of costs. And while I'm talking about this, let's jump back into Dynamics and look at the cost sheet while we're talking about this, just so I can give you a better idea of what we're looking at. Okay, so here we have the costing sheet inside of Dynamics. And like I said, this provides a formatted display of costs, and it gives you a structured breakdown of the cost of goods sold for a manufactured item or production order. And it typically includes a few kind of standard things that all manufacturing companies have, right? We have direct material costs, direct manufacturing costs, and indirect costs. So direct material costs would be like raw materials and components that are consumed in the production of a product. We have direct manufacturing costs. That would be like the labor of the worker or the machine time that's being run in order to complete a route operation step. And then we have indirect costs, which are like electricity, maintenance, any kind of overhead things that we have, right? And the framework for this indirect cost calculation kind of defines the basis for implying indirect costs through formulas such as surcharges and rates. Surcharge being, you know, some percentage of some kind of labor cost that's associated with a route operation step, and then a rate would be just some kind of flat fixed dollar rate that's associated with, you know, let's say it costs, you know, $20 per hour to run a certain machine. And you can define both of those inside of the cost sheet for specific parts of your manufacturing process. So again, if I look here, we have these cost of conversion tab here, and we have separate ones for material and labor, right? So if we are, again, we go back to our assembly example that we were looking at in the route for that first route operation step, right? We have a cost group of L2, which if you remember, right, back to our cost category here of the assembly cost category, that's that cost group that we saw on the assembly there. And that comes right back to this costing sheet, so it knows exactly where to draw from as far as reconciling these costs against the overall production cost and the overall product cost. So why does this costing sheet matter? So from a pretty high level, it matters because it shows you exactly how costs are built up for each production order, right? It supports standard costing and variable analysis between planned and actual costs. It helps you make decisions as far as and be more informed about how much things actually cost in a real life production scenario. It helps you with pricing strategies, with budgeting, and ensuring accurate cost allocation for any kind of financial statement. So the key components that we've talked about here for our costing sheet, right, are cost groups. Each one of these nodes here on this costing sheet has a cost group, right? And that's important to define, again, if you want to have accurate GL postings. And we have cost groups for each one of the different nodes on here, and then we have cost groups for each one of the different materials, and you'll notice that it's a different cost group for labor and for materials, right? Because we obviously want to segment and make a difference between those two in our cost sheet, since most cost controllers want to see, you know, how much am I charging for materials, you know, how much am I charging for labor, and how much am I charging for overhead, right? So we talked about overhead a few times. Down here in this cost sheet, we have overhead, we have plant overhead, we have material overhead, and we have labor overhead. So labor overhead, probably the most simple one to understand, right? We can define labor overhead by site, which is great, right? If your environment has multiple sites, each one of them can have a different kind of indirect labor cost overhead associated with it, right? You can see down here this rate, right? We have different current active rates for each site, and then obviously the amount of the overhead rate. And this overhead rate is, again, if you remember back to our route, is applied directly to the amount of time that we say it takes per route step to create a finished good. So adjusting the runtime, the setup time, the quantity, right, in conjunction with the amount that you have here on the costing sheet will give you a real life costing scenario that you can use to model how much it costs to produce 1 unit of a finished good. And that way you can have a better idea if you're looking at GL postings or you're looking at kind of budgeting for an entire year's worth of production runs, how much you think it's going to cost to produce a set amount of goods. So, talked about all of this, just talked about key components, kind of covered this practical use and production control. That's where you would kind of dive into those costing sheets to configure it based on what your specific production environment looks like. But like we've talked about before, it's really important to just remember that most production companies, most manufacturing companies will still have material costs, manufacturing costs, and indirect costs. So if we go back to that production costing sheet, right, it's important to define each one of those on our costing sheet, right? Material overhead costs, plant overhead, labor overhead, and then labor and materials in there specifically, right? I would say having those three on your costing sheet will really set you up for success when it comes to migrating that data into cost categories and then into our routes. Okay. So calculating machine and labor costs, quick step-by-step process from kind of a very high level, right, would be what we talked about first, right? Create the route and assign operations. You are then going to link those operations with resources and cost categories. And again, those cost categories are going to be defined on each one of your route operation steps and associated with each resource, or if you want to group resources together, each resource group, right? You want to then enter operation times. So how much does it take to set up a certain operation step? How long does it take to run that certain operation step? Or how much time does it take to queue up materials to get ready to set up that operation step? You can then assign resource groups to each one of those. Then, once that's set and you have a route with a costing backbone set up, ensuring that you have BOM data on the release product that aligns with route operations. And what I mean by that is, let's say if we take the simple route that we saw earlier, where it's operation 10, 20, 30, 40, right? If you have a BOM, you can say, I want to consume these raw materials from the BOM on operation 10, I want to consume these other materials on operation 30, and so on and so on, right? If you don't define specifically on the BOM when those materials are consumed, it's fine. You're just going to need to either consume them at the beginning of the production order or at the end of the production order. You can't consume them as the production order progresses through the route, right? Because the dynamics won't know specifically when in this route do you want me to consume these raw materials. And then once that's all set, you can run the cost calculation in a production order by starting a new production order, loading that release product into it and estimating the production order, or you can go directly to the released product and run an item price calculation using that BOM and route that you've set up for that release product. Some of the biggest pitfalls I think that we see as far as getting inaccurate costing data on a manufactured process after setting up a route would be that you're simply just missing a cost category on any one of those route operation steps, or we have incorrect time and time standards set up on those route operation steps. And what I mean by that is I've seen many instances where we've said, oh, it takes an hour to produce, X amount of goods, but the X amount of goods is defined as a partial quantity of goods or as a multiple quantity of goods, simply by mistake. And what that causes is an inaccurate cost calculation because the financial controller that's working with the production controller to kind of come up with an idea for how to set up the costing sheet, how to set up these route operations, is simply not fully understanding how these time standards work in conjunction with other steps on the route operation. So if you're seeing inaccurate costing come out, those would be two of the first things to check. And lastly, the last thing to check would be simply just making sure that you're operating in the right financial year and fiscal period. Now, I've seen instances where the wrong fiscal year was being set when we're estimating release product and production orders, and that caused old data to be brought in, right? So if on the costing sheet, you can define from and to dates for each one of these overhead nodes, so indirect costs, material costs, or manufacturing costs. You can define start and to periods for each one of those, and if you're operating outside of those time periods, then you're not going to be bringing in the most accurate data. Sometimes you're not going to be bringing in any kind of data at all, and it's going to show up as 0 on your costing sheet. So ensuring that you have those set are probably some of the most important things that you can do. And like I said at the beginning, it's good to start simple with routes and costing, and then further refine as you get things to be more and more accurate to the real life production process that you're going through, right? This is rarely something that's done 100% of the way through the first time, and is more commonly done in steps, right? Working towards a most accurate version of a real life production cost that you can, as well as kind of making sure that you're not overestimating or underestimating the amount of material costs, manufacturing costs, and indirect costs that you're incurring on a production process. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you learned something throughout this entire process. It is simultaneously a complex and a simple thing to set up, and it most of the time incurs a lot of questions and confusion. And so when I say trust me that you're not alone in being confused, I mean it. I've set it up many times for different clients, and each one of them has been a unique experience, and it's something that I've always learned something from every single time that I've done it.